story today is playing defense. Good afternoon to you. I am Dylan Ratigan. We begin with our money and our national defense. We are currently, as we all know, in the longest war in our nation's history. The cost of blood and treasure simply staggering. Yet when there are calls for cuts in spending or ending the wars, the military-industrial complex says, no, not yet, not now, not this month. And that's even in this time of incredible economic distress here at home. If you think the debate is new, of course, think again. Going back to 1961, Republican Dwight Eisenhower, the general who won D-Day and helped end World War II, issued this warning to all of us about what would happen if we were not careful.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the position of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted.
Well, since then, we've taken a few things for granted. We've had 10 presidents since President Eisenhower. 5 were Democrats, 5 were Republicans. And yet the military-industrial complex has spent and wasted trillions on defense across all 10 presidencies. First up today, former 3-star Admiral and Democratic Congressman Joe Sestak. Admiral, how relevant is this fact? 92% of senators had donations from the defense sector in 92% get money from defense. How relevant is that fact?
It's very relevant. Whether it's the healthcare industry, pharmaceuticals, even education, money plays an undue role in how politicians act, consciously and unconsciously. In particular, though, what has happened is that every congressperson's district has a depot, a shipyard in their district or state. And so as you begin talking about reducing the defense budget, you're beginning to talk about jobs. And unfortunately, some people who are very concerned about the growth of federal government tend not to see that in some areas this has become not only a welfare type of job creation, but it also means that we're not stopping programs that aren't best for our warriors as we have to potentially fight the next conflict. And that's the problem with the money that does flow from these lobbyists.
And when you look empirically at what it means to have a military strategy, a national defense strategy, if you were, as an admiral, running a room, trying to define and prioritize defense strategy, both in information collection, logistics management, actual equipment, and mobilization, how would that meeting look like, and are we even having it anywhere?
I'm concerned that we're not. If you saw, and I'm sure you did, Secretary of Defense Panetta's recent speech just a few days ago, he talked that we do have to address our future military under a strategy-based case. And yet nowhere did he lay out what our strategy is to be. For example, since the fall of the Soviet Union, the entire size of our military on the whole has been based upon fighting 2 wars simultaneously. One of those is almost over, Iraq. And the other, Korea, has not had the Army be able to defend Korea for the past decade because of its involvement in Iraq. And yet we've been told that is acceptable risk. Nowhere have we had anyone lay out what is the strategy for the future, except for the word strategy. And so therefore, are we just holding on to relative Cold War programs, platforms, and building those, which will give us a good military, or are we beginning to transform the military to what we saw over these recent years, that knowledge, the ability to know where your adversary is? Not more ships, not more aircraft, but to know is really the type of warfare capability we need to the future.
And that's the definition of open source warfare. Open source warfare is you have the ability to know where every digital point is, including the location and identity of the opposition, obviously. There's another component to this story with the prolonging of these wars and the spending of these wars, and it is this. This is my other statistic of the day. Only 0.05%, so at 1/2 of 1%, of the U.S. population since 9/11, so that's a decade, has been on active duty. 1/2 of 1% of the U.S. population over a decade of war in multiple countries has been on active duty. This is significantly lower, as the chart illustrates, than World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War. And I'm interested in your point of view on a country that would dare to run its military on the backs of 1/2 of 1% of the population, while the rest of the population is told to never mind.
This is something that you've put your finger on that we have to think deeply about. I came into the military when there was still a draft during the Vietnam War era, and then we became a volunteer force. To some degree, we had to go there of a necessity. When we bring a sailor or a soldier in today, we can often put them through a year of training on very sophisticated equipment before we place them in the field, and we need a return for that investment of 3 or 4 years. But it also means that our military is becoming a bit divorced from the society that it serves, and the society doesn't quite understand as well as it once did those who are serving. And so I think this is really something that we have to think through as you begin to maybe grapple with the issue of national service, a choice of AmeriCorps versus the military, one longer in years than the other. But I do think that there are less people, particularly in Congress, that have a feeling and understanding for military. My own party often won't even stand up and argue whether this platform or weapon is really needed because they're a bit concerned about being regarded as weak on defense, where stopping that program, less cost pursuing something else in cyberspace warfare might be better. And yet, often people are worried because they don't understand, and that is part of this issue we're talking about today.
If you were to look at the political benefit to incumbent politicians of having a military where very few people participate, how beneficial is it to the power base to not have too much of the population too exposed to too much war for too long?
Not helpful. Look, I'm going to spend this November 11th, Veterans Day, in a maximum security prison in Pennsylvania. I do it every year. I'm meeting with veterans. And they in Johnston just formed a new chapter there, and I'm going to go to speak with them. 47% of our veterans who are in jail are there for a drug or alcohol-related crime, coming back from either Vietnam or Afghanistan or Iraq with PTSD. People don't understand because they're not exposed to what we've placed our warriors in. I would argue that our military leaders are the most conservative in going to war because they understand what the cost can be, as you've seen with that tragic misadventure in Iraq. And so this issue of having more families, more of our general population understanding our military and being part of probably sharing that or some other form of national service, I think would make us potentially make wiser decisions in what we're pursuing.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your exploring of those two data points with us, the 92% number in terms of the funding in our Congress and obviously the participation levels. I suspect you voiced the concerns of truly millions of Americans, and you do so very eloquently, and I'm grateful for your own courage to come out and have this conversation in public. I hope that we'll have a lot of this conversation over the next year, Admiral, and thank you.
Thanks for having me on again, Dylan.
All right, Admiral Joe Sestak, coming up here on the